Ah, it's true. Let's see, I need. Oh, okay. Political power in Australia.
Đi thẳng mãi xuống cái đường Bắc Ferry đúng không?
Hindi mo magpa-picture diri taod-taod. Hindi mo picture ba? Later. Wala ka tayong bawal tamo undang. Uy, there's a duck. Duck mo siya. Taas ko na ikso. Mama ni? Mama ka? Ha? Mama ka?
Maybe they're friendly here kay city bird, but
absolutely nothing for the enrollment levels because people don't go to the degree based on how much it costs. So we're now here in Hyde Park, and this is one of my personal favourite places in Sydney. It's a really nice bit of green space. You can just come out of the city, you know, sit down, have your lunch, get a bit of shade, which is very nice, especially in the summer months, and then you can walk right back into whatever it was you were doing before. Historically, the site of Sydney's very first horse races. Well, you won't find that many horses here today, so maybe the police mounted unit. But what you will find is this big white bird with a long black beak. Some of you might have seen it around. There was one while we were walking up here. It's called an ibis. Colloquially, it's known as the bin chicken, for reasons which will probably become apparent. They may once have been majestic birds, but they've now evolved to steal picnics. So watch out for that. That goes for all the bird life in Sydney, actually. I had a friend down at Darling Harbour who was about to eat a burrito, and from behind her a seagull flew up behind her head, nosedived into the burrito, came out with a head covered in guacamole, squawked, and then flew away. So watch out for the birds. They will steal your food. Now I can see you guys looking at this fountain behind me here. This is the Archibald Fountain, and it was commissioned in 1932 at the request of a man named J.F. Archibald. He was a prominent 20th century figure in Sydney. He owned a popular current affairs magazine called The Bulletin. He was also a bit of a character. Before I tell you what sort of a character he was though, I'm going to give you a few moments to try and figure out what this fountain is supposed to be representing. And I want to hear your guesses as well.
Ganun siya makawala or dili ra?
guess na.
Greek mythology? Greek mythology?
Yeah.
Farming.
Farming?
How'd you get to farming?
Kamutan na yung magbaka man rin.
Signs of the zodiac.
What was it?
Not the signs of the zodiac.
Zodiac, maybe. So they're all good guesses.
At least good yung farming.
So J.F. Archibald really liked France. So much so that he even changed his name on one of his many marriage certificates from John Feltham Archibald to Jules Francois Archibald. So apparently this fountain is supposed to be showing Australia's connection to the French during World War I. Yeah. For some reason the sculptor, Francois Sicard, has decided to use Greek mythological figures to show that connection. There's Apollo up the top there with the lyre, there's Pan, the god of nature, and Diana, the Roman version of the Greek goddess Artemis of the hunt. The idea is they're supposed to represent different parts of what people go to war for. You know, them in the Theseus behind breasting the Minotaur, the noble sacrifice. It's all very tenuous. I think the main explanation is just, it's art. But perhaps the fact that J.F. Archibald liked French so much goes some of the way to explaining that connection. But if you follow where Apollo is pointing, across College Street there, you can see St. Mary's Cathedral. It was originally built in 1821, but it burnt down in 1865, and they didn't start to rebuild it until 1868. And it took them about 130 years to fully complete the building. I say complete with quotation marks because the rest of the building was done long before 2000 when it was fully complete, but it was only in 2000 that they put those big spikes on the top of it, which was when it was a full cathedral. That's why it took them so long. When the Olympics turned up in Sydney in 2000. Guess they wanted it to look nice. So while we're here in Hyde Park, I'll take a bit of time to tell you about the history of Sydney. No history of Sydney or of Australia is complete without remembering the first people to live in Sydney and Australia were the First Nations peoples. Said earlier, you might have heard them referred to as the Aboriginal Australians. Now, archaeological evidence dates their inhabitants in Australia back 60,000 years ago. Some sources say even longer, 80,000 years ago, which makes them one of, if not the oldest living continuous set of cultures on Earth. So while you're here in Sydney and in Australia, I definitely recommend taking some time to learn about some of that history and some of that culture, because it is an integral part of our identity as a country. A good place to start with that would be to go to the Australian Museum. From here, to get to the Australian Museum, you want to walk through the park, you walk that direction, or you can walk along College Street until you get to the first intersection, and it's a big sandstone building that says Australian Museum on it. The logo looks like a squiggly line. You can't miss it. And they've got some exhibits on First Nations history and artifacts, as well as some classic museum exhibits on things like animals of Australia and dinosaurs and that sort of thing. And all their permanent exhibitions are free entry. So yeah, on the fence about checking them out for some money, don't worry about it. You can just walk into a lot of them. And it was recently renovated as well, so they're all very new. Nice. So throughout Australia, our First Nations peoples had between 300 and 500 different clans, each with their own languages, cultures and beliefs. The Sydney city area was home to a group of people known as the Gadigal people, and the wider Sydney area was a group of 29 different clans known as the Eora Nation. And these people were some of the first affected by European settlement in Australia. Speaking of European settlement, some of you may know that in 1770, Captain Cook sailed up the east coast of Australia on a mission from England. What you might not know is that the Dutch sailed up the west coast in 1606, and most people like to forget about that part for some reason. At this time in England, their jails were overflowing with criminals. They had a bit of a poverty problem, so people were getting sentenced to jail time for stealing things that they needed to live, like bread. And after the war, in what would become the United States of America, they couldn't send them over there anymore. So they thought, what better place to send all of our criminals than this new country we've just discovered? So in 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip arrived in Sydney Cove with the First Fleet and claimed the land for England using a policy known as terra nullius. Terra nullius meant that, according to the colonists, the land didn't belong to anyone, so it was theirs to take. Which, as we know, was completely untrue. So although there was some initial curiosity and friendliness between the colonists and the First Nations, it soon devolved into conflict, which largely decimated the First Nations population. By 1792, Sydney colony was dealing with resource shortages and famine, because they were mostly reliant on shipments coming over from England, which could of course be shipwrecked. And by the 1840s, they'd stopped sending convicts here altogether. They were instead replaced with free settlers, so people who weren't criminals, they were just coming to make a life for themselves in the new colony. So things started to stabilise a bit. And then in 1851, the first of a number of gold rushes started in New South Wales, and then a much bigger one in Victoria. Brought great prosperity to Sydney, but also to Melbourne, which started a debate as to which city was better. The debate really hasn't stopped yet. Case in point, in 1901, when Australia federated under the rule of British monarchy, we had to decide which city would be our capital city. And so Sydney put its hand up and said, hey, I'm the oldest, I have the richest cultural heritage, it should obviously be me. And Melbourne said, no look, sit down, Grandpa, I'm younger, cooler and bigger than you are, which they were at the time. But both cities fought so fiercely that the rest of the country got a bit bored. So we had to cut our losses, and we built an entirely new city and an entirely new territory kind of in between Sydney and Melbourne, and we called it Canberra, which today is our capital. These days though, Sydney is a very cosmopolitan cultural city. I often get asked, what is the national dish of Australia? What is the local cuisine in Sydney? I can't really give you a good answer. If you want a particular kind of food, the chances are you can find it here. People come from all over the world to build their lives here, so they bring their food with them. But I do actually have one candidate for the national dish of Australia. Put your hands up. Who here's tried Vegemite? Keep your hands up, keep your hands up. Who here likes Vegemite? No one, not one person. Oh, I got one. Very good. Okay, I'll come back to you in a minute. So for those of you who don't know, Vegemite is not Nutella. This is a mistake lots of people make. They go into a jar of Vegemite expecting sweet, chocolatey goodness, and instead they get salty yeast extract. So it is possible to enjoy Vegemite, as evidenced by our friend here. How do you like to enjoy Vegemite? Only your poached eggs. Just the poached, or do you have them on toast as well? With toast, yeah. So I think the key thing here is have Vegemite with something else that isn't Vegemite. Because it's more of a flavour enhancer than an actual flavour in and of itself. Although some people do just have Vegemite on toast with butter. If you haven't tried it, I think you should try it at least once, even if it's just so you can say, nah, never doing that again. I'm not entering into the Marmite versus Vegemite debate. I have never tried Marmite, so I can't honestly compete. I've heard, yeah, some people say Vegemite's better, some people say Marmite. I don't know, I haven't tried it. Yeah, look, the take-home message is if you want a particular kind of food in Sydney, the chances are you can find it. But from here, I'll give your brains a bit of a rest, and we'll head over this way towards Macquarie Street. So, that statue that I pointed out earlier is a statue of Major General Lachlan Macquarie. And he became the governor of Sydney Colony in 1810. And he was quite influential in his time. He built roads, bridges, wharves, and public buildings, all with the aid of convict labour, because that's largely what the convicts were used for, was free labour to build the colony. And because he commissioned so much stuff in Sydney, he got a lot of it named after him, including this street here, which is Macquarie Street. And the more time you spend in Sydney and in New South Wales, the more things you will find that are named after Governor Macquarie. For instance, we've got Macquarie Bank, Macquarie Park, Macquarie Place, Fort Macquarie, Port Macquarie, Lake Macquarie, Lachlan, oh not Lachlan Swamp, that's a different thing. I saw a block of flats the other day named Macquarie Flats. I don't know if that had anything to do with him. My money is on it did. So, very influential, little bit of an ego. But he believed that Sydney could be a big, grand city with good town planning and good architecture. And when it came to Sydney, Macquarie even had a favourite architect. His name was Francis Greenway. But the funny thing about Francis Greenway was that he was actually a convict as well. He's sentenced to transportation to Sydney for forgery. And if you think it's a bad idea to have a convict design lots of your important buildings, you're probably right. Can you imagine what would happen if you let the convicts build a bank? That's a story for another day. But nonetheless, Greenway was put to work designing a number of buildings in Sydney, including the two that were on either side of us here. So the one behind me is Hyde Park Barracks. It was built in 1819 to lock the convicts up at night. Now, initially, when the convicts arrived, they were given more freedom of movement than you might expect. Because if they tried to go anywhere, they would either get lost, starve, drown, or just generally die. So no one was really worried about them escaping. But when there started to become more of them, they started to kill each other and steal things, generally just cause a bit of a ruckus. So they built Hyde Park Barracks to lock them up at night. And these days, it's a museum to the history of the building. It's quite a good museum if you're interested in that history, because it's, again, kind of like the Australian Museum, recently been done up, renovated. It's across the 3 levels of the building now. They've recreated what some parts of that used to look like, but then other areas there are dioramas of building Hyde Park Barracks and other parts of our colonial history. It's also free, is the other thing. like lots of our museums here. So if you're interested in that history, definitely check out Hyde Park Barracks. Now across Macquarie Street, you see St James Church. It was built in 1824, and when it was built, it was probably one of the taller structures in Sydney, although today obviously it is. Next to it though, you can see what is the tallest structure in Sydney. So look to the left and up, you can see Sydney Tower, or Centre Point Tower. It stands at 309 metres tall, and it's mostly just a big tourist attraction. You can get a view out over the city. If you do have to pay for it though, unfortunately. $26.40 on their website. You have to book. That gets you a general admission ticket to the observation deck. There's also some bars and some restaurants up there. Up at bar 34, so bar 83. You can go up there. It's a minimum spend of $30 per person, but if you do go up there, get yourself a drink and you sip on it really, really slowly, you can get a 360-degree view of the city without moving, because it slowly spins around. The bar does. Now, I mentioned it was called the Sydney Tower, Centre Point Tower. Some people call it the Golden Bucket. Kind of see what they're getting at. But there is actually a 162,000 litre water tank up there that acts as a counterbalance to stop the whole thing from tipping over in strong winds. So if you stretch your imagination a bit, you could say it is in fact a giant golden bucket. From here, we're going to head around this corner, this little alcove, to take a look at the south wing of the Rum Hospital. So, you know, Macquarie was a very influential figure, and he was so influential that there are now 2 statues of him. There's another one back here. It's probably a bit more realistic, a bit less flattering, which is maybe why they hid it away. But, you know, he believed that Sydney could be more than just a criminal colony. He believed it could be a big, grand city. Now, you can't have a big, grand city without a big, grand hospital. So Macquarie wrote home to England for some money to build a hospital, because they didn't actually have enough hard cash with which to pay people. But neither did England, so he didn't get the money. He wasn't done though. He thought to himself, Sydney-siders love rum, or any alcohol for that matter, and someone's got to sell them that rum. So he found himself some businessmen. He said, right, I'm giving you complete rights to manufacture and sell alcohol to the colony for 3 years if you build me a hospital. So, with the aid of possibly drunk convict labour, that is exactly what they did. They built the south, central and the north wing of what became known as the Rum Hospital. So it's not just a place where you go to drink and get better, although I'm sure few Australians would like some. But the amount of hospital they built was way too big. They didn't need all of it. So, for the first part of its life, the south wing became surgeons' accommodation. And then in 1855, it became the very first branch of the Royal Mint outside of England, which all money that was flowing through Australia because of the gold rush. These days, it's just a little museum to the history of the building, which is open on weekdays if you're interested in learning more about this building in particular. And it's also free entry, like many of our museums. But the south wing wasn't the only part of the hospital they built. So we'll go and take a look at the central wing now. We're going to